Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Tony. Yes, it's a real pleasure to be with you, and a relish the opportunity of sharing a few ideas. And as we go through this, chatting to Fee earlier, it's kind of really important to get a sense of what's it like to be challenged, to be ambitious. And I'm going to be talking you through a framework I've been developing, which some of you will have seen before, which I'm framing around the idea of ambition design, which is to say, how do we design the interventions that we're involved with, the work programs, if we calibrated where we're trying to head towards with an appropriate ambition in relation to what's going on around us. And the problem we've got at the moment is that's not the way that we deliver most of our programs of work in public, third, or private sector. So I'm going to talk this through for about half an hour. We're then going to have a breakout group hosted by our facilitators. We're going to be going through a couple of questions, which I'll introduce later on, and then back together in here. So it's a four-part story: the why, the what, and how of ambition design, 2 breakout questions, and then back together for the end, in total finishing in just under 90 minutes. So the first question that we're here to think about is, where is it that we want our plan to take us? And those plans can be anything from our own individual work plans, the organizations we're working with, the wider PSB, the RPBs, or the place that we're living in. And I really want to hold that question, saying, where is it that you want your plan to take you? And the framing for this is partly around this idea of risk. And for me, this conversation is about not only the risk, but what's the result that we want to get in relation to the way we manage that risk? And critically, what's the context in which we take those 2 first considerations? And all of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with this idea of the risk matrix. This is a really simple version of one where you look on 0 to 5 ranking about the probability of an event happening and the consequence of it happening. And if the probability and consequence are low, you'd get a green score on this one, which might be 1 or 2. And if the risk is high, you'd get a multiple of 4 or 5 and get those top scores. And in most organizations today, at a practical level, that might look like something like, if you had a live wire or you found exposed broken asbestos, it'd be a red risk and you'd stop work in that place until your risk had been dealt with. And the intention, wherever possible, is to reduce risks by taking management approaches. But the problem is we're not really being very effective at applying what I would call good risk management in terms of the context or the results that we want to get. Because part of the problem is that we design most of our legislation, I would argue, at one level around convenience. It's relatively convenient to legislate for things like plastic straws or single-use drinking cups. But this beach on the right-hand side, near where I live in Solva, and I live in St David's, this is one of the beaches near Solva, all of this plastic waste is a consequence, pretty much nearly all of it is the consequence of the fishing industry, which can lose this kind of stuff on the seabed or over the sides of vessels at no cost. So nobody today picks up the cost of this damage in their fish fingers or their piece of plaice, or in terms of the cost of the nets or the fishing boats or anything else. So the legislation is quite convenient to look good by introducing these pieces of plastic straws or cotton buds, but it doesn't even go close, for instance, on plastics, to where we're trying to get to. And the legislation for environment, for instance, was never set with the intention of creating thriving conditions in which future generations can live. At best, it takes the wrong thing and does it better. In terms of designing for comfort, when we're talking about future generations, we tend to have quite limited frameworks. On the left here is my grandson, daughter, my dad, who last week was 100 years old. It's amazing. We went for a bike ride together, him on his electric bike, his electric trike, and his great grandchildren in the trailer. We could talk about children and grandchildren, perhaps. But last summer, I worked on an archaeological dig down at White Sands. We were excavating skeletons that were 1,300 years old. And it really got me to reflect on how advanced are we at thinking about how do we think about the generations who are going to be walking in our footsteps in 50 generations' time or 100 generations? Because whether we like it or not, they'll be living with the consequence of many of the decisions that we make today. So it's comfortable to think about only 1 or 2 generations, but I would argue it's not the right thing to be doing. In the world of food, we design things, broadly speaking, for profit. So in the health sector, health boards typically procure food based on the lowest cost, regardless of what's in it around nutrition or what impact it has on environment or local communities. And we've got these fantastic examples like the bug farm near us, who until Brexit were able to procure food quality bugs to put into food. And they make these, for instance, incredible cricket and cauliflower pakoras. So, insect food and innovation is great. But on the right-hand side in this graphic from the World Benchmarking Alliance, this is 350 of the world's biggest food companies. And as you can see on this, only 26 of them had 26 out of 350 of the biggest companies had a target that's in line with where we want to get to on climate. And over half of them have no target for reducing their emissions at all. So the profit gets in the way of doing the right thing. And when it comes to things like housing, critical area for Wales and massively important about addressing poverty, is we have these kind of 2 extremes. So the easy model is to go for the big box home builders who kind of have these buildings like on the right-hand side, this one from Persimmon Homes, for instance, where I've been told every 3rd house is 100% profit. And that's all fully compliant with all of the laws. You can have non-renewable resources all over the property, but it's compliant with the law. On the left-hand side, you've got the amazing Down to Earth project in Pennard, where they built these 6 units used out of Welsh timber with Welsh insulation and working with the refugees and people who've come on health schemes to build the houses that builds confidence and builds community and gives people the skills to live better quality lives. Both of them are compliant, but only one of them is really lifting the game in terms of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So within this piece, a big call to action for me was this phrase that I've often heard, I'm sure Laura will have done as well, around saying, let's get realistic, but we need to be realistic. And more often than not, it seems the phrase realistic doesn't necessarily mean the same for every person. And just take a second or 2 to reflect on what does that phrase being realistic mean in your workplace, or if you were to utter it. For me, it always used to be about being realistic was about talking about things that I was comfortable with. But actually, the more I've got to know about climate and science and nature breakdown and so on, being realistic is about paying attention to the science more than it is about just the emotion about how I'm going to respond. So when people say, yes, but we need to be realistic, what I think they often mean is, that's all very well, but I haven't got any time, or I haven't got any resource, or do you know how long my action list is? And so when we use phrases like being realistic, if we're not careful, we step back from the edge of taking the leaps that we sometimes need to make, such as this one that one of our coasterian guides did on the coastline with us. But when you start getting realistic about what needs to be done, based on science and a different way of working, incredible things are possible. So in all of this, I would argue that our imagination is more important than the sum of our resources that are available from our own organizations. And the pieces that Laura's been talking about around, learning to think about ecosystems, learning to think about how to sense and get those feedback loops across entire communities mean that the resources that are available are the resources of our entire community for all of their waking hours, not just what's in our kind of job list. So when we're sparky enough and unbounded enough in our imagination, I believe we can untap an incredible level of resources to get things to happen. And within that, it's asking, I think, these two questions about saying, where do I stand on that idea about freeing my imagination? How comfortable do I feel talking about ideas that are beyond my current ability to deliver? Because it seems that we've created this space built on design for comfort, whereby we're only happy to put ideas forwards about things that we are within reach of achieving. And that's all very well, but that won't get us to the place that we need to in terms of our responses to climate and so on. You'll have seen these graphs all over the place in COP26. But to put this in perspective, this is the graph of 800,000 years of carbon emissions. We are off the charts today in terms of anything that's happened. Yet, in Wales, no government department, no businesses, and no third sector organisations that I've met have got a plan that gets them back to within 1.5 degrees within the time needed. To put this in perspective, by 2035, every single organisation in Wales, on average, needs to reduce their carbon emissions by 80%, 78%, compared to 1990 levels. By 2035, that's 13 years away. So in 5 or 6 years, every organisation needs to have a plan on how to do it. And at the moment, we're going in the wrong direction. If you haven't seen this way of looking at information before on this model, this is an incredibly powerful piece of work done by the Oxfam ecologist Kate Rayworth, looking at a model called donut economics. And the simple idea of donut economics, and it's applicable to a city as it is to a country or a planet, is that we have to manage these two dark green boundaries. One of which is making sure that we have a social foundation that's strong for everyone to live within, so they get to live a full life, lived within this ecological ceiling. And the work that's been done by the World Economic Forum, the Stockholm Resilience Institute and others shows that originally, this is last year's graphic, 4 years, and now it's been added to by pollution, we're overshooting the carrying capacity of our planet. And when you think about that future generations impact, that's clearly not good news, but also we're shortfalling in terms of the foundations around justice and fair pay at scale. And when you look at what's happening to our oceans as they warm up due to climate, most of the warming is due to climate. These series of graphics, which hit the media a few weeks back, are from an organization called Climate Central. In 2050, so when my grandchildren will be 30 odd years old, in 2050, these are the areas in the southeast of Wales and the north of Somerset that are forecast to be at risk from annual flood due to rivers or ocean flooding. And you can imagine the impact this has on communities and planning and resources. And we're not really preparing for this future as well as we could. And as Sir James Bevan, who's Chief Exec at the Environment Agency, talks about, our thinking needs to change faster than the climate. And our response needs to match the scale of the challenge. And that's really the call to action, I think, for us. And I want you to imagine for a moment that our climate, that the way we might respond to our kind of emergency training on climate and nature, poverty and justice, was a river descent. Lovely little map here of the River Wye, which I hope some of you had the chance to kayak or canoe down. But imagining that our river training was a descent. The problem is that we're planning our training today by either watching Netflix movies like The Amazing River Runner, which is a fantastic movie about kayaking, or we're doing gentle explorations on flat water and canals. That's quite comfortable, it's easy to do, and away we go. The problem is that the river that we're going to be heading towards in half a generation looks like this. In kayaking terms, this would be a class 5 or class 6 rapid. Excuse me. And most of our people are practicing by doing this. So here's my question. Let's imagine that we've got this framework here. And this is at the core of this idea around ambition design. So on the y-axis, performance, however we measure it. So whether it's outputs, about patients, about places, about trees planted, or whatever our thing is. Our focus of effort across the x-axis can either be dealing with compliance with the rules and regulations of the land in terms of the way that you work, or responding to the science and the reality of what's happening around you. And broadly speaking, you've got these 4 different areas to consider. So in the bottom right, third sector and academia, where they get what's going on, but are not necessarily delivering as much impact as they could. The public sector is, generally speaking, notwithstanding number 10 shenanigans, generally speaking is legal, but has limitations about what it can do through timescales and the ways it can work. Business can get stuff done and is largely compliant with the law. And in this top right-hand side in green is this idea of R10, which is asking, if you took the science and the reality on board, fully on board, and you thought about what 10 out of 10 performance would look like, what is it that you'd set out to do? And this is letting go of the challenges around those areas I discussed earlier on, where in the third sector and academia, they're limited, by the way, by funders' ambition, who won't give money for just experimental work too often. In politics, it's hard for leaders to talk beyond their term of government and their program of government in terms of ambition. So we end up, if we're not careful with a tick box approach to risk rather than things that take strategic risk into account. And for businesses, success is measured in money, but future generations and nature pick up the balance of the costs caused by those businesses to the damage to our oceans and our climate and so on. And ambition design is this piece around asking, what are the goals that match the evidence, not our level of comfort with them? And I apologize for background noise. So I want to talk about a couple of examples around that. And I'm very happy to share further information on these with anyone who's got particular interest in them. So with Wales Transition Lab, we've set up a country scale test track to reconnect the benefits that can happen at the intersection of food, nature and health. And one example of what we're doing there is working with Hywel Dda Health Board to optimize the food system for human health. And weirdly, we would find that the farmers have never ever spoken to the health boards about nutrition or food or outcomes. But we're at the start of the process of mapping those disconnects, asking what does best look like rather than better, which is a really different question. And I talked about this again before, the optimizing the food system is really thinking, what can we put onto a local plate and deal with that bigger issue? So we're working with NHS Wales about optimizing the hospital food system with Chris Morton. In the southeast Wales, starting in Cadoxton, there's this amazing little project to converted shipping containers in schoolyards, selling surplus in-date food from supermarkets. Parents can come in on a pay-as-you-feel basis. There's a whole bunch of resources to teach the kids and parents and teachers about the food system. And the goal is to create a food literate country where every single child understands the relationship between food, health and body. And after in year 3, there's 28 schools have got the funding to put the boxes in. If we can create a place where every single child leaving primary school understands that relationship between food, health and well-being of community, nature and business, then you can imagine that you can unleash this incredible level of benefits at a country level. In food, again, there's a lovely example. So there's a food app which some of you may subscribe to called Olio. They started not because the founders were particularly interested in food, but they're interested in carbon. And if food waste was a country, it'd be the 3rd largest in the world in terms of climate impact. And you have this other crazy piece that every family throws away 700 quid of the food every year. But Olio's goal is to reach 1 billion people with that app. Not because they want to make loads of money, but because they know that that's the scale of shift that is needed around carbon. And they've managed to so far shared 34 million portions of food and created a vision that was so clear that their funders, back end of last year, helped them raise $43 million to take their project into other countries. And in food retail, and we were chatting about this with the facilitators earlier, one of my favorite examples is the supermarket Hisby in Brighton, which stands for how it should be. And they call themselves supermarket rebels. And they've completely reimagined what that looks like. So they've got 130 local suppliers making, pasties and soups and flapjacks and growing, producing eggs and so on. The smallest suppliers are paid in just a couple of days because they know they haven't got the cash flow. And they produce 11.5 times the benefit for communities the big box supermarkets do. And what that looks like is if you could take that at a scale across Wales, you'd create £2.4 billion a year of benefit for communities at no cost to those communities. Can you imagine the difference that would make in terms of physical and mental well-being for people who are living on lower wages? That 2.4 billion can be spent amongst the people who need it most. But to do it cannot happen with a single organisation pushing this boat up by themselves. It needs housing associations, NHS trusts, it needs local councils, it needs everyone around the table to say how much and how quickly could we relocalise our food to benefit our communities and nature. And as we think about this future generations piece, again from a bigger picture perspective, if you haven't come across it, Roman Kusnarek wrote this amazing book year before, called The Good Ancestor. And he asks this question in effect, saying, how many generations ahead dare we dream? And he put this in perspective in terms of the numbers of people alive today, that tiny green dot in the middle of the screen, and the 100 billion people who've lived in the last 50,000 years. But when you flip ahead 50,000 years, every single person living in that orange dot will, of course, be a descendant of someone on Earth today. And we have a responsibility as green dot inhabitants to think not just about our children and grandchildren, but recognize that the impact that we're making, particularly around nature and climate, can take way beyond 50,000 years and the lives of 6.7 trillion people to change. And we haven't even got the conversation started yet about how to do that, but that doesn't take away the need to start thinking many more generations ahead. And as we go down this process of stretching our imagination and thinking differently about where responsibility sits and what's possible, it's good to remind ourselves of the work done by Julian Rotter years ago, 40, 50 years ago, on this idea of locus of control. And Rotter was interested in the idea of do people consider themselves to be lucky or unlucky? And from that, he developed this model called locus of control. And the idea of locus of control is you can either externalize or internalize how you feel. And externalizing can come across as, yeah, you've got to be realistic, or there's nothing I can do. I haven't got the resources. I can't do that. And the one advantage of externalizing things is that you can always be right. You can always find a reason that you can't make a difference. And on the flip side, but the downside to being to having that external locus is that you don't get much to change. On the flip side, when we internalize things, this is not about saying, I take responsibility for all of the world's challenges. I'm going to try and fix everything. But internalizing it is recognizing that I have a power to make change and to react to things as I choose. So I can react to not having lots of resources as I choose. I can choose how to respond to someone saying yes or no in any way that I want. But it also means, when you take that internal locus of control, of recognizing that sometimes we just weren't good enough. And that's okay, because that's part of the process of learning. And if people said no to our wild idea, then we can just go back and improve it. We can ask them for feedback. We can do as Laura suggested and think about our wider ecosystem and keep practicing. The big advantage of taking that internal locus of control is that you are in charge of how you feel, and you're in charge of kind of making your own luck. So what we're going to do in a couple of minutes now is we're going to switch into breakout rooms with your facilitators, and I'm going to ask you to think about two main pieces, and your facilitators will ask someone in the group to come up with come up with a kind of a consolidated response as far as the group. And there's 3 pieces I want you to do. Initially, just reflect on what is it your area of kind of predicament or challenge that most concerns you around the need for this appropriate ambition and ambition design. To take a couple of minutes to reflect on that in that first part of it. And they take time in your groups to share that ambition with your peers. And I want you to really hold that space of being as ambitious as you need to be to match the evidence around you that tells the story about change. And I want you to notice, what is it like being asked to be that ambitious? I would argue that if you feel that ambition just in your head, and it's just a mind thing, you're like a puzzle, you're probably not being ambitious enough. If when you state that ambition, you feel it much deeper down in your gut, then that says to me you're starting to get close to the level of discomfort and possibility that comes with appropriate ambition. So in that first part, think about your predicament. Think about what you'd set out to do if everyone you asked said yes, and you got the resources that you need, and share it with your peers. And as each of you is sharing, I invite the rest of the people in that group to write down a couple of questions that you would ask that person in response to their challenge, about saying, do you know what good looks like? Or have you thought of asking these people specific questions? And then once you've done that round, which will take around about 20 minutes, staying in the same breakout groups, we'll move into this space of collaborative questioning. And we're going to take turns. You have about 2 minutes each or thereabouts to listen to the questions that other people were sparked by when you presented your ambition. And your task is not to try and answer, very specifically, not to answer those questions, but just sit with them and notice the questions. And in each group, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like one person just to capture the broad sense about what was the quality of ambition in the room, and how are people feeling about that. And then we're going to come back together in that third step for a final 20 minutes. And I'll ask people from each of those groups, A to F, just to take a couple of minutes to share the kind of ambitions and qualities that came out for that, and ask any wider questions within the group. And knowing the resources that are available within Academy Wales, and knowing the kind of networks that they've built, and certainly recognizing some of the names and faces of those participating, I am absolutely confident that the only thing between you and some of these much bigger changes that would deliver for your communities is asking the questions today that you don't know the answer to, but that become a bonfire that's compelling enough to draw other people towards it. And in that bonfire of possibility, like Laura was saying about building those ecosystems, you will find that if the idea is clear and it's exciting enough, other people will start phoning you up and saying, how can I get involved? How can I support you? And it's those combinations of people and passion and clarity of ambition that I think break the boundaries between what's happened in the past and what can happen in the future. So I'm going to stop there and ask you, as we go through it, really take a moment before we break out to take a couple of deep breaths and notice, the magic that's around us in that space every day, connecting ourselves to the world that Laura talked about and the world of possibility that you're paid to deliver every day. Notice how you feel about this request to state an ambition that you may have never stated before, and of the range of possibilities about wild ambition or an easy answer. Make a conscious choice about which one you're going to pick to share with your colleagues, because I believe that the bolder it is, the more remarkable it'll be as we share and learn going forwards. So thank you very much from me. I'm going to share that now, exit that now, and we're going to jump into those breakout groups from here. Diolch yn fawr. Just to close, I had some trepidation about asking you that question about stepping into that space, and I've just been blown away by the phrases that you've used about the kind of that passion and excitement and the radical and finding it enjoyable, and recognizing that when we start to ask the question, what would we do and we could if we couldn't fail, you stop having to lie about what you're capable of doing. And although we don't have the knowledge about how to do it yet, you can start telling the truth about what you really want to do. And I think it's doing that that makes the hairs on your arm stand on end, and that's where the change comes from. So from me, thank you ever so much. If you're any of you ever down in this neck of the woods, as I say, it takes very little effort to prize me for a walk or a kayak or whatever else, or just to meet for a coffee. This is helping you make the kind of changes that you've discussed happen, is what we exist for as an organization, and anything I can do to help, call me in. Thank you so much. Diolch yn fawr.